The gray whisper opening channel narration amid the noise of day and the silence of the dark night. Where the boundary between reality and imagination begins to fade. There lies gray whisper, opening a doorway into this earthly world. Hello, my friends. Welcome to your channel. Tonight, for a few moments, I would like to be a guest in your home, bringing you a mysterious tale from beyond the veil. If you choose to walk this path with us, your likes and comments are more than support. They help this space grow and thrive. And if you have not yet joined our gathering, consider subscribing and activating the notification bell so that we may always remain by your. Previously on The Secret of the Fig Trees in Grandfather's Garden, we heard the story of a man named Mostafa, as told by his grandson, Mostafa. Mostafa was a poor young man who worked on the lands of the village Khan. One night, while working in the fields, he noticed a wolf hunting an unknown creature. Suddenly, a voice echoed inside his mind. Startled, he threw his shovel at the wolf, giving the creature a chance to escape. A few nights later, two young men arrived at Mostafa's house and asked him to come with them to heal the injured leg of the Khan's son. Along the way, Mostafa realized that their feet looked like those of horses. Fear gripped him, and he silently called upon the name. One of the two men, who appeared human, said, "Do not be afraid of us. We also worship God, and we mean you no harm." Then they took Mostafa by the hand and rose into the air. Moments later, Mostafa opened his eyes in a land of breathtaking beauty. And now, the story continues. I was still in shock, looking around at everything and filling my lungs with the air of that place, because the air flowing there was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was neither cold nor warm. It felt as though the air itself were alive. Slowly, I let my gaze wander across the landscape. A vast plain stretched out before me, its far edge disappearing into a mist of green and silver. Trees stood in the distance unlike any trees I had ever seen in the world. Some were tall and radiant with light, others were bent and peaceful, as though they were breathing. And far away, I could see houses built from stone and light. Nothing like the houses in our village. Nothing like anything I had ever known. One of the two young men was still standing beside me. His smile was calm. Not frightening, but strange. He said, "This is our land, Mostafa." I could not find the words to answer. My throat had gone dry. I could only stare. Suddenly, a voice came from behind me. A calm voice, but a heavy one. I turned around. A man was standing there. Not like the two young men. This one was older. He wore bright clothing, and there was a depth in his eyes that made it seem as though he had known me for a very long time. He said, "So, You finally brought Mostafa." The two young men lowered their heads. The man stepped forward a few paces. Then he said, "The king is waiting." The moment I heard those words, a shiver ran through my body. The king? Before I could ask anything, he turned and began walking, motioning for me to follow him. We started forward. It was as if I were walking across a memory. The farther we went, the heavier the air became, and the deeper the silence grew, until at last we reached a gate. A towering gate, forged from black stone and blue light. Strange symbols were carved across its surface, symbols I could not read. Guards stood on either side. They, too, were not ordinary. Like the two young men, there was something different about them. Their eyes were calm, yet watchful. The man stepped forward, and without anyone touching it, the gate slowly opened. At that moment, a strange feeling tightened in my chest. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of something far more unknown. I stepped inside. Beyond the gate stood a vast hall. The light did not come from the ceiling. It seemed to come from the space itself. And at the far end of the hall, there stood a great throne. And upon it, someone was seated. At first, I could not clearly see his face, but his presence was overwhelming. It felt as though the entire hall was listening to him. The man who had brought me there bowed his head slightly and said, "My king, he has arrived." A complete silence fell over the hall. And in that very moment, the king slowly raised his head, and his eyes settled upon me. 5. He looked at me carefully, as if he could read everything inside me. Then he said, "Mostafa, you are the one who saved my son's life." I froze. His son. Before I could say anything, he raised his hand and continued. "The night you threw your shovel at the wolf, you did not know it, but you saved my son from that wolf." My mind completely locked. The king stepped closer and continued. "That night, my son had come to your world with his teacher for exploration and training." Then he pointed at the older man I had seen when I first arrived and said, "His teacher looked away for a moment, and suddenly a wolf attacked my son. And because you were closer, a voice was placed in the teacher's mind telling you to throw your shovel. You did it with all your strength. But he twisted his ankle. He then pointed toward a room and led me inside. A small boy was lying on a bed. The king said to me, 'Treat my son's leg.' I was no longer afraid. I walked toward the boy. I asked them for warm water, sheep fat, turmeric, and clean cloth. They brought everything immediately. I prepared a poultice and placed it on the boy's leg. Then I said, "This must stay on for 3 nights. It must be changed every night. On the 4th night, I will be able to set the bone properly." The king nodded. The boy smiled. I smiled back. Then I left the room and returned to the hall. The king looked at me and said, "Tomorrow night, you will come yourself to change the poultice." I nodded in agreement and said, "I will come. But if possible, take me home early tonight. My wife is alone." The king stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. He looked at the 2 young men and said, "Take him back to his home." They bowed and walked toward me. I said goodbye to the king and left the hall with them. They took my hands. My eyes closed on their own. And a moment later, I found myself standing in front of my house. I opened the door. My wife said, "You forgot something. Did you come back?" I realized she had not noticed my leaving or my return. I said nothing. Dinner was already prepared. I ate. And with my mind overwhelmed by everything that had happened, I fell asleep. 6. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed. It felt as if I had more energy than on any other day. I walked toward the water well to wash my face and hands. My wife called out to me and said, "Come to the sheepfold." I headed toward the sheepfold. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I owned a few sheep, and we used their milk for our own needs. My sheep had only recently given birth. But to my astonishment, they had given birth again, and each of them now had a pair of twin lambs. At first, I could not make sense of it. How could a sheep that had just given birth give birth again? Then I remembered the previous night. And I realized that this could not be unrelated to what had happened. I turned to my wife and said, "Don't tell anyone about this. God has placed a blessing upon our lives." My wife took care of the sheep. And after breakfast, I headed to the landlord's fields. I worked there until nearly sunset. Then I returned home. I was hungry. I ate some bread and yogurt while waiting for dinner to be ready. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I looked up at the sky. It had already grown dark. Then I remembered. I had an appointment with them. I had promised to return and replace the remedy on the king's son's leg. I walked to the door and opened it. Yes. It was the same 2 young men. From the doorway, I called to my wife. "I have some business to take care of. I'll be back once I'm done." "As always," she replied. "Take care of yourself." I greeted the two young men, and they greeted me in return. They asked me to take their hands quickly. The moment I did, my eyes closed. A moment later, I opened them once again in that green plain. I had returned to the land of the benevolent jinn. Together with the same elderly man, I made my way toward the king's palace. When we arrived, the king was not on his throne. The old man led me to the room of the young prince whose leg had been injured. Once again, I asked for warm water, sheep fat, and turmeric. Then I prepared another remedy. I applied it to the boy's leg and wrapped it with a clean cloth. When I finished, I stood up. I looked at the young boy. He smiled at me once more, and I smiled back at him. Then the old man and I left the room. We had not yet left the palace when I saw the king returning. The king gestured to the elderly man accompanying me. He stopped, and I stopped behind him. Then we approached the king. I greeted him. He returned my greeting and said, "Were you pleased with our gift in your sheepfold?" I had completely forgotten about that matter. Surprised, I asked, "So that was your doing?" With a smile, he replied, "We never leave a good deed unrewarded." Then he continued, "I will be expecting you tomorrow night." I said goodbye to the king. Then I returned home with the two young men. The two of them vanished in an instant. I knocked on my door. My wife came to the entrance and said, "What have you forgotten this time?" At that moment, I realized that she had not noticed my absence at all. I went inside. A short while later, my wife laid out dinner. After eating, I went to my bed, and I quickly fell asleep. 7. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my wife calling me. I felt even more refreshed than I had the day before. I walked out into the yard. My wife was standing beside the garden, staring at the chicken coop in astonishment. I walked over. We owned a few chickens and a rooster. But that morning, there were countless chicks inside the coop. I turned to my wife and asked, "Tullet, when did these chickens lay eggs that hatched into chicks? Didn't we only have a few chickens? There are more than 100 chicks here." Tullet looked at me and said, "I collect the 3 or 4 eggs they lay every day. I have no idea where these chicks came from." At once, I understood. This was their doing again. I turned to my wife and said, "Don't tell anyone about this. It is God's blessing upon our lives." Then I washed my face and hands. After eating some bread and cheese, I headed to the fields. Nothing unusual happened throughout the day. Near sunset, I returned home and waited for the two young men. As soon as darkness fell, someone knocked on the door. I picked up my coat and went to answer it. It was the same two young men. I closed the door behind me. I greeted them, and they returned my greeting. They took my hand, and a moment later, I was back there once again. Together with the elderly man, I headed toward the palace. The king was seated upon his throne. I greeted him, and he greeted me in return. I entered the room and sat beside the boy. I smiled at him, and he answered with a smile of his own. Then I removed the old remedy from his leg. They had already brought warm water, sheep fat, turmeric, and a clean cloth. I prepared a fresh remedy, applied it to the boy's leg, and wrapped it carefully. Then I stood up. Just as on the previous 2 nights, we exchanged smiles before parting. The following night would be the last, and I would finally set the boy's injured leg. The king and I returned to the palace hall. He asked me about my life. I replied, "Thanks be to God, I am content with whatever my Lord has given me." Then he said, "Ask something of us." I answered, "You have already shown us great kindness today. What more could I ask for?" The king smiled and said, "Tomorrow morning, go to the well beside your house. Dig beneath the apple tree in your garden. We have left something there in your care. Take it and hide it. Tomorrow night, I will tell you what to do with it." I nodded and said, "As you wish." Then we said our farewells, and I walked toward the 2 young men. I placed my hands in theirs, and a moment later, I found myself standing in front of my house. I looked around. The 2 young men were gone. I pushed open the door and went inside. We ate dinner together, and then we went to sleep. 8. I woke up the next morning. Once again, I felt unusually refreshed. Ever since I had begun traveling to their land, it felt as though new life had been breathed into me. I walked out into the yard and headed toward the water well. There, I noticed a shovel leaning against the side of the well. I immediately remembered what the king had told me. I began digging near the apple tree. The soil was soft. It looked as though it had been dug up recently and then covered again. After digging about half a meter down, 3 clay jars emerged from beneath the earth. I quickly pulled them out one by one and carried them to the livestock shed. I dug several holes, buried the jars inside them, and covered them carefully. Then I returned to the yard and smoothed the disturbed soil near the apple tree so that no one would suspect anything. After washing my hands and face, I went back inside. I ate breakfast and then headed once more toward the Khan's farmland. That day, the Khan was expected to inspect his fields. I was busy working in the farm when, after a few hours, I heard the sound of a flock of sheep. I looked up. A herd had wandered into the Khan's fields and was eating his crops. I ran as fast as I could and drove the sheep out of the field. But the Khan had already seen what had happened from a distance. He was galloping toward us on horseback. The moment he reached me and the shepherd, he lashed me across the back with his whip. Then he turned on the poor shepherd and beat him so severely that his body became covered in bruises. I struggled to pull him away and calm him down. But then he turned back toward me. This time, he slapped me hard across the face and began hurling insults and foul words at me. I lowered my head and said nothing. The Khan then walked back toward the field. Suddenly, I heard him scream. At first, I thought perhaps the shepherd had done something. I turned around. What I saw left me stunned. The same two young men were standing beside him. They were striking him with punches and kicks. The shepherd stared in confusion and said, "Has he gone mad? Why is he throwing himself onto the ground?" At that moment, I realized that the shepherd could not see the two young men. I hurried toward them and pleaded with them to stop beating the Khan. The two young men turned toward him and said, "Ask Mostafa for forgiveness. Otherwise, you will not live to see the night." The Khan immediately fell at my feet. He kissed my hands and cried out, "Forgive me, Master Mostafa. By God, I did not realize what I was doing." The shepherd watched us in complete astonishment. I said, "I forgive him." Then the two young men spoke to the Khan again. "You will pay Mostafa everything that is rightfully owed to him within 1 hour. From this day forward, he will no longer work for you." Trembling with fear, the Khan replied, "Yes, of course." He mounted his horse and rode away. Less than an hour later, he returned. He was carrying a leather bag. The two young men were still standing beside me. The Khan handed me the bag and once again asked for my forgiveness. I opened it. Inside was enough money to exceed the earnings of 10 years of hard labor. I forgave him. Then I returned home. My wife asked, "Why did you come back so early today?" I handed her the bag and said, "To be honest, I don't fully understand it myself yet." Then I told her what had happened with the Khan. Of course, I said nothing about the two young men. Afterward, I lay down and closed my eyes. When I woke up, it was nearly sunset. I ate some of the bread that Tullet had baked, along with a little cheese. The sky gradually grew dark. Then there was a knock at the door. I picked up my coat. Turning to Tullet, I said, "I have something to take care of. I'll be back soon." Just as she always did, she simply replied, "Take care of yourself." 9. I opened the door and greeted the two young men. They returned my greeting. I placed my hands in theirs, closed my eyes, and a moment later I found myself once again in that beautiful land. Together with the old man, I made my way toward the palace. The king was not in the main hall. We went directly to the prince's room. There, I saw that the king was already present. I greeted them. Both the king and his son returned my greeting. It was the first time I had ever heard the young prince's voice. I smiled and asked him, "Is your leg feeling better?" The boy smiled and replied, "It feels much better." I removed the bandage and examined his leg. In my mind, I wished that the king and the old man would help hold his leg steady. Suddenly, the king chuckled. Then he and the old man stepped forward and placed their hands on the boy's leg. I carefully set the bone back into place. When I looked at the prince's face, I saw that he was still smiling. I smiled back and said, "It's finished, my friend. Rest for a day or two, and then you can go wherever you wish." I glanced toward the king. He nodded his head in gratitude. Then he quietly left the room. After saying goodbye to the prince, I followed the old man outside. We returned to the great hall. The king was seated upon his throne. I stood before him. He asked, "Did you retrieve the items buried beneath the tree?" "Yes," I replied. "And because you told me to hide them, I buried them inside my livestock shed." The king nodded. "I know. You were being watched, and I was informed." Then he continued, "Now I understand that you are worthy of the gift we have given you. First, you did not rush to dig beneath the tree on the very night I told you about it. Had you done so, you would have found nothing. Second, when you uncovered the jars, you did not even look inside them." I replied, "Because you told me to dig there in the morning. And when I removed the jars, you instructed me to hide them. I thought perhaps I was not permitted to look inside. Or perhaps they were simply something entrusted to my care." A look of satisfaction appeared on the king's face. He smiled and said, "The jars belong to you. They are filled with gold coins." For a moment, I was speechless. Then he continued, "Tomorrow, take one of the jars to the town marketplace. Find Farouk, the Jewish antique dealer. Give him this letter and hand him the jar. He will pay you for it. Tomorrow night, my men will come for you again. Return here, and I will tell you what to do next." Then he added, As for the other 2 jars, do not worry. They belong to you as well. They are protected. No one except you will be able to touch them. The king then turned toward the old man. The old man handed me a rolled piece of parchment. I understood that it was the letter the king had mentioned. I took it carefully. Then I said goodbye to them all. The 2 young men escorted me back home. After eating dinner, I went to bed and quickly fell asleep. Tonight's tale comes to an end here. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Your thoughts, interpretations, and reflections are always welcome and help this path grow stronger. Until we meet again with another tale, between the noise of day and the silence of the dark night, may light guide your path. Headphone wishing you a peaceful night ahead. Leave the whispers to us. Good night.